10 doctors tried to save the biker leader's son until a poor black girl did the impossible. Chapter 1. The rain fell like a curse over Memphis that October night. Cold, relentless drops hammered the glass windows of St. Michael's Hospital, where hope had become a word no one dared to speak anymore. Inside room 412, the machines beeped in a rhythm that sounded more like a countdown than a heartbeat, and in the waiting area, a man who had never begged for anything in his 53 years of life sat with his head bowed, his calloused hands clasped together, trembling for the first time since childhood. Marcus Stone was not the kind of man who trembled. He was the president of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club, a brotherhood of over 300 riders spread across 7 states. His arms were covered in ink that told stories of war, loss, and survival. His voice alone could silence a room. His reputation preceded him in every small town, truck stop and highway bar from Tennessee to Texas. People crossed the street when they saw him coming. Bartenders poured his whiskey before he asked. Prosecutors had tried and failed to pin anything on him for 30 years, but none of that mattered now, because inside that hospital room lay his only son, 17 years old, name of Elijah, the boy who had his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn spirit, the boy who had never wanted to ride motorcycles, who preferred books over engines, who dreamed of becoming a writer someday, the boy who, 3 weeks ago, had collapsed in the middle of his English class and had not woken up since. The doctors called it a mystery. That was the word they used when they didn't know what else to say. Mystery. As if Elijah's life was a riddle instead of a tragedy. As if the machines keeping him breathing were puzzle pieces instead of prayers made of plastic and wire. 10 specialists had examined him. 10? From Memphis to Nashville to Atlanta to Chicago. Neurologists, cardiologists, immunologists, experts in diseases so rare they didn't have names in most languages. They ran tests that cost more than some people's houses. They scanned his brain, his heart, his spine. They took samples of everything a human body could offer. And every single one of them had walked out of that room with the same expression. Confusion, frustration, surrender. We don't know what's wrong with him, they said. His body is shutting down, but we can't find the cause. It's like something is attacking him from the inside, but we can't see it. We can't name it. We can't fight it. And now, after 21 days, Elijah Stone was running out of time. The doctors had given Marcus the talk that afternoon, the one with soft voices and carefully chosen words, the one that started with, "We've done everything we can," and ended with, "You should prepare yourself." They suggested he call family. They suggested he say goodbye. Marcus had listened in silence. Then he had walked out of the room, crossed the hallway, entered the stairwell, and punched the concrete wall so hard that 3 of his knuckles fractured. He didn't feel the pain. He didn't feel anything except the weight of a truth too heavy to carry. He was losing his son. Outside the hospital, the parking lot was filled with motorcycles. Over 40 bikes lined up in perfect rows, chrome gleaming even in the rain. The Iron Wolves had come from everywhere. Vice presidents, sergeants-at-arms, road captains, prospects, men who had ridden through blizzards, through deserts, through territories controlled by rivals, men who had stood beside Marcus through wars both literal and symbolic. They stood now in the rain, not saying much, just being there, because that was what brotherhood meant. But none of them could fix this. Inside the hospital, the staff had grown used to their presence. At first, security had been nervous. 50 bikers in leather vests filling the waiting room was not exactly standard protocol, but the Iron Wolves had been nothing but respectful. They spoke quietly. They cleaned up after themselves. Some of them had even donated blood when the hospital asked. Whatever judgment the nurses had held at the beginning had slowly transformed into something like admiration. "These men loved that boy," one nurse had whispered to another. "You can see it in their eyes." And she was right. Elijah had grown up surrounded by the club. Not as a future member, but as a kind of little prince, protected and adored. The men who looked like villains to the outside world had read him bedtime stories, had built him tree houses, had cheered at his school plays. They called him Little Wolf, even though he was neither little anymore nor particularly fierce. He was gentle, thoughtful, the kind of kid who wrote poems about things like rain and memory and forgiveness. And now he was dying, and the wolves could do nothing but wait. Marcus sat alone in a corner away from the others. He had not eaten in 2 days. Sleep was a stranger. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elijah as a child, running through the clubhouse, laughing, asking 1,000 questions about everything. Why is the sky blue? Why do engines roar? Why do people hurt each other? Marcus had tried to answer every single question, even the ones that had no answers. Now he wondered if he had said enough, if he had been present enough, if Elijah knew, truly knew, how much his father loved him. The hospital chaplain had come by earlier, offering words of comfort. Marcus had listened politely, then asked to be left alone. He didn't know what he believed anymore. He had seen too much darkness in the world to trust in light, but somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the leather and the scars, and the years of hardening himself against everything soft, there was still a flicker of something. Hope. Desperate, irrational, stubborn hope. He looked up at the ceiling, at the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above, and for the first time in 40 years, Marcus Stone asked a question to whoever might be listening. Please, I'll give anything. Everything. Just let my boy live. The hospital corridor stretched into silence. The rain kept falling, and somewhere on the 4th floor, a young woman in a pale blue uniform pushed a cleaning cart past the door marked 412. She paused, looked at the name on the chart hanging beside the door. Stone. Elijah. Her name was Destiny Johnson, 23 years old, born in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Memphis, raised by a grandmother who had worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. Destiny had never met her father. Her mother had disappeared when she was 6. She had grown up in houses where the heat got turned off in winter, where dinner was sometimes just bread and water, where hope was a luxury nobody could afford. But she had survived. More than that, she had fought. She had worked her way through high school with honors. She had earned a scholarship to community college, then another to nursing school. She had studied 18-hour days while cleaning offices at night just to pay rent. And now finally, after years of sacrifice, she was 3 months away from completing her nursing degree. The cleaning job at St. Michael's was temporary, just something to keep her going until graduation. She mopped floors, emptied trash cans, wiped down surfaces. Most people didn't even see her. She was invisible, like all cleaning staff in all hospitals everywhere. Just another person in a blue uniform, beneath notice, beneath consideration. But Destiny noticed everything. It was a habit she had developed in childhood, when noticing things could mean the difference between safety and danger. She noticed how people walked, how they breathed, how their eyes moved. She noticed patterns that others missed. It was part of what made her such a good student, why her professors said she had instincts that couldn't be taught. And right now, standing outside room 412, she noticed something. The chart. She had seen dozens of charts in her months at this hospital, but something about this one caught her attention. She leaned closer, even though she knew she shouldn't. Patient files were confidential. She was just a cleaner. She had no business looking, but she looked anyway. The symptoms listed on the chart were strange. Unexplained neurological decline, respiratory irregularities, metabolic dysfunction without identifiable cause. The tests listed were extensive, the specialists numerous, and yet no diagnosis, no treatment plan, just 3 words that made her chest tighten with recognition. Unknown etiology. Palliative care recommended. They were giving up. Destiny had seen those words before, not in a hospital but in her own home, 15 years ago, scribbled on papers that her grandmother had hidden in a drawer. Papers Destiny had found one night when she was looking for birthday candles. Papers that talked about her grandmother's condition, about the doctors who couldn't figure out what was wrong, about the recommendation to make her comfortable. Her grandmother had lived another 12 years after that, not because of a miracle, not because of expensive medicine or fancy specialists, but because a neighbor, an old woman from Haiti who grew herbs in her window boxes, had recognized something the doctors had missed. It was the water, the neighbor had said. Your grandmother's body can't process certain minerals. There's something in the pipes here, in this old building. It's been accumulating in her system for years. Stop drinking the tap water. Eat certain foods that help flush the toxins. Give her this tea every morning. The doctors had laughed at the idea. Alternative medicine, they called it, folk remedies. Nonsense. But Destiny's grandmother had listened, and slowly, impossibly, she had gotten better. Destiny had never forgotten that lesson, that sometimes the answer wasn't in the tests or the technology. Sometimes it was in the things that fell through the cracks, the questions nobody thought to ask, the patterns nobody thought to see. She looked at the chart again, then she looked at the door. Then she did something she knew could get her fired. She knocked. A voice from inside, rough and tired. What? She pushed the door open slowly. I'm sorry to bother you, sir. I'm just here to clean. The man sitting by the bed looked up, Even in his exhaustion, even with red-rimmed eyes and a face that hadn't seen a razor in days, Marcus Stone radiated an intensity that made most people step back. But Destiny had grown up around intensity. She didn't flinch. Their eyes met. Something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or just the shared understanding of people who have seen hard things and survived them. "Go ahead," Marcus said quietly. "Just be quiet if you can." Destiny nodded. She began moving around the room, adjusting her path so she could get closer to the bed without being obvious. The boy lying there was pale, thin, beautiful in a fragile way. The machines surrounding him hummed and beeped. The IV lines ran into his arm like desperate prayers. She looked at the monitors, at the readings scrolling across the screens, at the pattern of numbers that the doctors had seen 1,000 times, and then she saw something small, something buried in the data like a whisper behind a shout. Her heart began to beat faster. "Sir," she said, her voice barely above a murmur. Marcus looked up sharply. "Sir, how long has your son been in this hospital?" The question seemed to startle him. 3 weeks. Why? And before that? Was he healthy? Active? He was fine. Perfect. Then one day he just... Marcus's voice cracked. He just collapsed. Destiny nodded slowly. Her mind was racing now, connecting pieces that didn't seem to belong together. The symptoms, the timeline, the location. "Sir, I know this is going to sound strange, and I'm not a doctor. I'm not even a nurse yet. I'm just a cleaner. But has anyone asked about his diet? Specifically what he was eating or drinking in the weeks before he got sick?" Marcus stared at her. For a moment his expression was unreadable. Then something shifted in his eyes. Not hope exactly, but curiosity, attention. "They asked about allergies," he said slowly, "about family history, about 100 other things. But diet, I don't think so." Destiny took a breath. She knew she was stepping into territory that could destroy her. A cleaning lady questioning the work of 10 specialists, suggesting they had missed something. It was absurd. It was arrogant. It could end her career before it even started. But then she looked at the boy on the bed, at his still face, at his chest rising and falling with mechanical assistance, and she thought about her grandmother, about the neighbor with the herbs, about all the people in her neighborhood who had died because they were invisible, because nobody with power or money or credentials had bothered to look at them closely enough. She made her choice. "Sir," she said, her voice steady now, "I think I might know what's wrong with your son. And if I'm right, we don't have much time." Marcus Stone rose from his chair. He towered over her, his presence filling the room like a storm. Most people would have wilted under that gaze, but Destiny held her ground. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low. "My name is Destiny Johnson. I'm nobody important. But I've seen something like this before, and I think your son is being poisoned. Not by a person, by something in his environment. Something he was consuming that built up in his system until his body couldn't handle it anymore." The silence that followed was deafening. Then Marcus did something that would change everything. He listened. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel, because stories like this one prove that miracles don't always come from the places we expect. They come from the people brave enough to speak when everyone else has given up. Chapter 2. The next 48 hours would become legend among the Iron Wolves. They would talk about it for years in clubhouses and on long rides, around campfires and at memorial services. The story of how a cleaning lady walked into a hospital room and changed everything. The story of how Marcus Stone, the most formidable man most of them had ever known, put his faith in a young woman whose name the world didn't even know. But in the moment there was no legend. There was only chaos, doubt, and a desperate race against time. After Destiny finished explaining her theory, Marcus had stood in silence for what felt like hours. His mind was processing, calculating, trying to find the flaw in what she was saying, because there had to be a flaw. She was a cleaner. No credentials, no authority, no reason for him to believe her, except for one thing. She was the first person in 3 weeks who had offered him something other than surrender. "Explain it again," he said, his voice tight. "Slowly. Everything." Destiny nodded. She moved to the corner of the room, away from the bed, and began. "When I looked at your son's chart, I saw the symptoms they've been tracking. Neurological decline, organ stress, metabolic irregularities. The specialists have been treating each symptom as a separate problem, but they all point to the same thing. Systemic toxic accumulation. Poisoning," Marcus said flatly. "Not the kind you're thinking of. Not deliberate, environmental. There are certain heavy metals that the body can't process well. They accumulate over time, especially if the exposure is consistent. The symptoms start subtle: fatigue, headaches, difficulty concentrating. Then they escalate. The nervous system starts failing. The organs start shutting down. And unless you know what to look for, it looks like a dozen different diseases at once. Marcus's jaw tightened. The doctors ran tests. They would have found something like that. They ran standard tests. But heavy metal toxicity requires specific panels that aren't part of routine blood work. You have to suspect it to look for it. And most doctors don't suspect it because it's rare, it doesn't fit their training. How do you know this? Destiny hesitated. For a moment, she looked like the young woman she was, tired and uncertain and carrying burdens too heavy for her shoulders. Then she straightened. Because I watched my grandmother almost die from the same thing. Old pipes in our building were leaching lead into the water. She drank it every day for years. By the time she started showing symptoms, the doctors had no idea what was wrong. They ran test after test. They talked about hospice. They told us to prepare for the end. Her voice wavered but didn't break. Then a neighbor, an old Haitian woman who had seen things like this before, told us to stop drinking the water. She gave my grandmother specific teas and foods that helped the body flush toxins, and slowly, my grandmother got better. She lived another 12 years. Marcus was silent. His eyes searched her face, looking for deception, for self-interest, for anything that would explain why a stranger would walk into his life with answers that specialists couldn't find. He saw only earnestness, only a young woman who believed what she was saying. Even if you're right, he said slowly, how would Elijah have been exposed? We don't live in some run-down building with bad pipes. Our water is filtered, our food is normal. Destiny nodded. That's the part I don't know. I'm just telling you what I see in the patterns. Something was getting into his system consistently, over weeks or months. But I can't tell you what without knowing more about his daily life, his routines, the places he went, the things he consumed that nobody else in your house consumed. Marcus began pacing, his boots heavy on the linoleum floor. His mind was racing through memories, through details, through every moment of the past several months. He's 17, he said almost to himself. Almost. He has his own life, his own friends, things he does that I don't always know about, but he's a good kid. He doesn't get into trouble. He doesn't. He stopped. Something flickered in his eyes. There was something, he said, his voice dropping. About 6 months ago, he started spending time at this studio, an art studio in Midtown, some kind of community space for young artists. He loved it there, said it was the only place he felt like himself. Destiny leaned forward slightly. An art studio? Yeah. Old building. Converted warehouse. They do painting, sculpture, photography, all kinds of stuff. Elijah got into sculpting, metal sculpting. He made some pieces for his mother's birthday for some of the guys at the club. He was proud of it. The pieces were connecting now, and Destiny could see them falling into place like a puzzle revealing its picture. Metal sculpting, she repeated. Did he work with the metal directly? Cutting, grinding, polishing? I think so. He came home sometimes with dust on his clothes, said it was part of the process. And did he eat or drink while he was there? Use the water from that building? Marcus's face went pale. There was a coffee maker. He mentioned it once, said the coffee tasted like history. So I thought he was just being poetic. The air in the room seemed to shift, heavy with implication. Sir, Destiny said carefully, old warehouses like that often have outdated plumbing. Sometimes they have lead pipes or copper pipes with lead solder, and metal sculpting, especially with certain alloys, can release particles into the air that get inhaled or ingested. If your son was spending hours in that environment, breathing that air, drinking that water. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Marcus turned toward the window, his reflection ghostly in the rain-streaked glass. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his fist came down on the windowsill, not hard, but with a controlled violence that spoke volumes. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks of watching my son die, and nobody thought to ask where he spent his time. It's not their fault, Destiny said quietly. They were looking at medical causes. Diseases, infections, genetic conditions. Environmental toxicity isn't on most doctors' radar. It's a blind spot in the system. I don't care about the system, Marcus said, turning back to face her. I care about my son. So what do we do? If you're right, how do we save him? Destiny took a deep breath. This was the moment of truth, the moment where theory met reality. First, we need proof. We need to get him tested for heavy metal toxicity. There are specific panels that measure lead, mercury, cadmium, arsenic in the blood and urine. If the levels are elevated, we have our answer. And if they are, then there's treatment. Chelation therapy. It's a process that binds to the metals in the body and helps flush them out. It's not instant. It takes time. But if we catch it before there's permanent damage, people can recover. Marcus moved toward the door, his entire demeanor shifting from grief to purpose. How do I get these tests? You have to convince the medical team. Tell them what we discussed. Ask them to run the panels. And if they refuse, if they think this is nonsense, Destiny met his gaze directly. Then you find a doctor who will listen, or you take him somewhere else. But sir, whatever you do, do it fast. Every hour matters now. Marcus nodded once. Sharp and decisive, he paused at the door and looked back at her. Why are you helping me? You don't know us. This could cost you your job, your career, everything. Destiny looked at Elijah's still form on the bed, at the boy who was someone's entire world. Because I know what it's like to be invisible, she said. To have something valuable inside you that nobody sees. And I know what it's like to lose someone, because the people in charge weren't curious enough to ask the right questions. I couldn't save everyone I've lost, but maybe I can save him. For a moment, something softened in Marcus's stone-carved face. Then he was gone, striding down the hallway with a purpose that made nurses step aside and security guards reach for their radios. Within the hour, the Iron Wolves were mobilizing, not for war, for something more delicate than war. Marcus had gathered his officers in the hospital parking lot, rain still falling. Breath visible in the cold October air, he explained everything, leaving nothing out. He told them about the cleaning lady, about her theory, about the art studio and the coffee and the metal dust. Some of them looked skeptical, others looked confused, but none of them questioned his judgment. Not out loud. Anyway, Marcus Stone's word was law, and if he believed this young woman had the answer, then they would act as if it were true. Here's what we're doing, Marcus said, his voice cutting through the rain. Bruno, you're taking a team to that art studio. I want samples, water, air, dust, everything. Get it tested at an independent lab. Pay whatever it takes. A massive man with a braided beard nodded. Done. Chainsaw, you're working the medical angle. Find me a toxicologist who will take this seriously. I don't care if they're in Memphis or Montana. Find one, get them on a plane, and get them to this hospital. A lean man with a scar across his temple pulled out his phone. I know a guy in Dallas owes me a favor. I'll make the call. Everyone else, I need you here. If the hospital gives us any trouble, if they try to dismiss this or slow us down, I want them to know that we are not leaving until my son gets the treatment he needs. The men nodded in unison. There was no cheering, no dramatic speeches, just quiet determination. The Iron Wolves had faced many enemies over the years. This enemy was invisible, but they would fight it with the same discipline and ferocity. As the group dispersed to their tasks, Marcus walked back toward the hospital entrance. He paused when he saw a familiar figure waiting by the door. Destiny. She had finished her shift, but she hadn't left. She stood there in her coat, a thin jacket that couldn't possibly be warm enough for this weather, watching the bikes and the men with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. You should go home, he said. You've done more than anyone could ask. She shook her head. I need to see this through. If I'm wrong, you're not wrong. You don't know that. Yeah, Marcus said slowly. I do. I've spent my whole life reading people, knowing who's lying, who's telling the truth, who's brave, and who's pretending. You're not pretending anything. You believe what you said, and you're willing to stake everything on it. That kind of conviction doesn't come from nowhere. Destiny was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, what happens if the hospital doesn't cooperate? What if they refuse to run the tests? Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Then we remind them who they're dealing with, not with threats, not with violence, but with presence, with persistence, with the understanding that we will not go away until they listen. That could take days, weeks. My son doesn't have weeks, but he might have days, and I will spend every single one of those days making sure that no door stays closed, no bureaucrat says no, no system ignores us. That's what I've built with this club, not criminal empire, not business, family. A family that takes care of its own by any means necessary. Destiny looked at him for a long moment. Then she made a decision. I'm staying, she said. Until this is over. One way or another, I'm staying. Marcus nodded. It was not a thank you, it was something deeper, an acknowledgement between two people who had both learned that survival sometimes meant trusting strangers. They walked back into the hospital together. The battle for Elijah Stone's life had begun. Chapter 3. The toxicologist arrived at 7 the next morning. Dr. Patricia Vance had been practicing medicine for 34 years. She had worked with miners in Appalachia, with industrial workers in Detroit, with communities exposed to contaminated water in Flint and beyond. Her reputation in the field of environmental medicine was impeccable, and her willingness to challenge conventional thinking had made her both admired and controversial. When Marcus's man called her at 2 in the morning, explaining the situation, she had listened in silence. Then she had said 4 words: "Book me a flight." She was a small woman with steel-grey hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. When she walked into St. Michael's Hospital, she moved with the confidence of someone who had walked into hospitals her entire career and never once been intimidated. The resistance she encountered was immediate. "We've already consulted with multiple specialists," said Dr. Harold Chen, the hospital's chief of internal medicine, who had been pulled from his morning rounds to deal with this situation. "This patient has received the best care available. Introducing external consultants at this stage is irregular and potentially disruptive." Dr. Vance smiled pleasantly. "I understand your concern, doctor. However, the patient's family has requested my consultation, as is their legal right. I'm not here to criticize anyone's work. I'm here to offer a second opinion focused specifically on environmental toxicology, which I understand has not been thoroughly explored. We ran comprehensive panels." "I'm sure you did, but standard panels don't include the specific markers for heavy metal accumulation. I'd like to order those tests with your cooperation. It will take a few hours to get results. If I'm wrong, nothing lost. If I'm right, we may have just found a treatable cause for this young man's condition." Dr. Chen hesitated. In his 25 years at this hospital, he had seen families grasping at straws, bringing in alternative healers and questionable consultants who complicated care and offered false hope. But something about this woman was different. She spoke with authority, not desperation. Her credentials were genuine and impressive, and there was another factor. Outside the conference room, in the hallway, he could see them, the bikers, 40 or 50 of them standing quietly watching. Not menacing, not aggressive, just present. A wall of leather and patience that made the message clear without any words being spoken. "We are not going anywhere." "Fine," Dr. Chen said finally. "Order your tests. But I want to be clear. If this turns out to be a waste of time, I will note that in the record." "That's perfectly fair," Dr. Vance said. "Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to examine the patient." The next 2 hours were a blur of activity. Blood was drawn. Urine was collected. Dr. Vance conducted a thorough physical examination, documenting every finding, asking questions that no one had thought to ask before. What was his living environment like? What water sources did he access regularly? What hobbies did he have? Had there been any renovations in his home or school recently? Was there any occupational exposure? Any unusual activities in the months before symptoms appeared? Marcus answered everything. When he mentioned the art studio, Dr. Vance's expression sharpened with interest. "Metal sculpting," she repeated. "Tell me more about that." While Marcus talked, Chainsaw arrived with the lab results from the independent testing Bruno's team had conducted at the art studio. The report was damning. Lead levels in the tap water were 7 times the acceptable limit. The ventilation system was inadequate for the type of metalwork being done. Dust samples contained elevated levels of cadmium and chromium. Dr. Vance read the report twice. Then she looked at Marcus. "This studio was a toxic environment," she said quietly. "Anyone spending significant time there would have been at risk, but a young person still developing, consuming water from these pipes, breathing this air for hours at a time." She shook her head. "The accumulation would be significant." "So Destiny was right," Marcus said. "It was not a question. The cleaning lady who raised this possibility? Yes, she may have just saved your son's life, but we need to confirm with the blood tests. They should be back within the hour." The waiting was unbearable. Marcus paced. The Iron Wolves took shifts standing watch, rotating in and out of the hospital, making sure their presence remained constant and visible. Destiny had been there all night, catching brief naps in the waiting room chairs, refusing to leave. When the results came, Dr. Vance called everyone into a conference room. Her face was grave, but there was something else in her eyes. Something like hope. "The blood work confirms it," she said. "Elijah has severely elevated levels of lead, with secondary accumulation of cadmium. The concentrations are high enough to cause all of the symptoms we've been seeing. But here's the important part." She paused, making sure everyone was listening. "These levels, while dangerous, are not beyond treatment. Chelation therapy can reduce the metal concentrations in his body. With proper intervention, there is a reasonable chance of recovery. Not guaranteed, but possible." The room fell silent. Then Marcus spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "When can we start?" "Immediately. I've already consulted with the hospital's nephrology team. We'll begin the first round of chelation today. It's a slow process, multiple sessions over several weeks, but every session will help reduce the toxic load in his system." For the first time in 3 weeks, Marcus Stone allowed himself to feel something other than despair. It was not joy, not yet. There was too much uncertainty, too much road ahead. But it was something. A crack in the wall of hopelessness that had surrounded him. He turned and looked through the glass partition to where Destiny was sitting in the hallway. She was looking back at him, her expression anxious, questioning. He nodded once, and he watched as relief flooded her face, as tears began streaming down her cheeks, as this young woman who had dared to speak when everyone with authority had gone silent finally allowed herself to hope too. The first chelation treatment began that afternoon. Elijah remained unconscious, his body still too compromised to awaken, but within 12 hours, the monitors began showing subtle changes, heart rate stabilizing, blood pressure improving. The smallest of shifts that, to the trained eye, suggested a body beginning to fight back. Dr. Vance monitored everything personally, rarely leaving the floor. She had cleared her schedule for the next 2 weeks, committed to seeing this case through. Something about it had captured her, the improbability of it all, the way a young woman with no credentials had seen what specialists had missed. "I want to meet her," Dr. Vance said to Marcus on the second day. "The woman who figured this out." Marcus arranged the introduction. Destiny was nervous, still convinced that she had overstepped, that at any moment someone would point out that she had no business doing what she had done. Instead, Dr. Vance took her hand warmly. "In all my years of practice," the doctor said, "I have never seen a cleaner make a more accurate diagnostic hypothesis. You have an extraordinary instinct, young lady. What are you studying?" "Nursing," Destiny said quietly. "I graduate in 3 months." Dr. Vance looked at her with an appraising eye. "Have you ever considered medical school? With your observational skills, you could go far." Destiny laughed softly, but there was sadness in it. "Medical school costs money I don't have. I'll be happy just to finish nursing, to finally have a stable job." "We'll see about that," Dr. Vance said, with a tone that suggested she was already making plans. On the third day, something remarkable happened. Elijah opened his eyes. It was brief, just a flutter of consciousness, a moment of confusion followed by exhaustion. But it was real. He was still there, inside that fragile body, fighting his way back. Marcus was there when it happened. He had been sitting beside the bed, holding his son's hand, talking to him the way he had talked to him since childhood, telling him stories, reminding him of memories, promising him that they would go fishing when this was over, even though Elijah had never been interested in fishing, and Marcus knew it. Then the eyes opened, brown eyes, his mother's eyes focusing with difficulty on his father's face. "Dad?" The word was barely audible, more breath than voice. "I'm here, son. I'm right here. You're going to be okay. I promise." Elijah's eyes drifted closed again, but there was a peace in his expression that hadn't been there before. As if in that brief moment of awareness, he had heard what he needed to hear. Marcus leaned forward and pressed his forehead to his son's hand, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, he wept. Outside the room, word spread quickly. The bikers embraced. Some of them hard men who had seen things that would haunt most people forever, wiped tears from their eyes with no shame. The nurses who had grown attached to this family smiled at each other. Even Dr. Chen, who had been skeptical from the beginning, nodded with something like admiration. But no one celebrated more quietly than Destiny. She had slipped away to a corner of the waiting room, overwhelmed by the emotion of the moment. She had told herself not to get too invested, not to let herself hope too much. She had been wrong before, about so many things. Life had taught her to protect her heart, but this time she had been right. And that boy, that stranger's son, was waking up because she had spoken when she could have stayed silent. Someone sat down beside her, Marcus. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Marcus said, "I don't know how to thank you. Words don't seem like enough." "You don't have to thank me," Destiny said. "I just did what anyone would do." "No, you didn't. Anyone else would have walked past that room. Anyone else would have minded their own business. You stopped, you looked, you thought, and then you had the courage to say something, even though it could have cost you everything." Destiny shook her head, uncomfortable with the praise. I saw something. I wasn't even sure I was right, but you were willing to be wrong. That's what courage is, not certainty, willingness." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a card. It was simple, just a phone number and a name. If you ever need anything, he said, you call that number, day or night. Doesn't matter what it is. Money, help, someone to have your back. You are part of our family now, whether you wanted to be or not. Destiny took the card, her hands trembling slightly. And one more thing, Marcus said. Dr. Vance tells me you're 3 months from finishing nursing school. She also tells me you have the mind for medical school, but not the money. Sir, I couldn't possibly. I'm not asking you to accept charity. I'm asking you to let us invest in someone worth investing in. There's a fund set up years ago by the club for promising young people who need a hand. You qualify. If you want to go to medical school, the money will be there. Destiny stared at him, speechless. Think about it, Marcus said, rising. But don't think too long. The world needs more people like you, people who pay attention, people who refuse to look away. He walked back toward his son's room, leaving Destiny alone with a card in her hand and a future she had never dared to imagine. If you're watching this and believe that one person can change everything, pause right now and leave a comment saying, courage is not certainty, it's willingness. Let's fill these comments with people who understand that sometimes the smallest voice carries the biggest truth. Chapter 4. The weeks that followed were a slow miracle. Chelation therapy was not dramatic. It did not produce instant results or cinematic moments of healing. It was a grinding, gradual process, measured in milligrams and percentages, in blood tests and careful monitoring. But with each treatment, Elijah Stone moved further from the edge of the abyss and closer to solid ground. By the second week, he was conscious for hours at a time. His voice returned, weak at first, then stronger. He asked about school, about his friends, about the art studio where he had spent so many happy hours, not knowing it was slowly destroying him. That conversation was one of the hardest of Marcus's life. The studio made you sick, Marcus explained, sitting beside Elijah's bed in the pale afternoon light. The building was old. The pipes were contaminated. The ventilation wasn't adequate for the work you were doing. The metals accumulated in your body until... He couldn't finish the sentence. Elijah was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, it wasn't their fault. The people who ran the studio, I mean. They didn't know. That doesn't matter to me. It matters to me. Elijah's voice was still weak, but there was steel in it, a reflection of his father's stubbornness channeled into gentleness. They were good people. They gave me a place to create, a place to feel like myself. That meant something. Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to rage against the carelessness that had nearly killed his son. But looking at Elijah's face, at the maturity in those young eyes, he forced himself to listen instead. What do you want to do? Marcus asked. I want the studio to get fixed. New pipes, proper ventilation, so no one else gets hurt. Can we help with that instead of blaming them? Marcus sighed. His instinct was vengeance, accountability, making someone pay for what had happened. But this was not his decision to make. If that's what you want, he said finally, then that's what we'll do. Within days, the Iron Wolves had descended on the art studio, not as enforcers, but as workers. They paid for environmental testing, for new plumbing, for a complete ventilation overhaul. Some of the members who had worked construction in their younger days volunteered their labor. The studio owners, terrified at first by the arrival of so many bikers, were overwhelmed when they understood what was happening. We didn't know, the director, a middle-aged woman named Louise, said through tears. We had no idea the building was dangerous. We just wanted to give young artists a space to grow. Marcus looked at her with complicated feelings. He wanted to hate her. Part of him did, but another part understood that negligence was not the same as malice, and that destroying this woman would do nothing to heal his son. Make sure it never happens again, he said, and consider offering free health screenings to anyone who spent significant time here. My people will help cover the cost. Louise nodded, unable to speak. Later that day, one of the studio's young artists, a teenage girl with paint-stained fingers, approached one of the bikers who was installing new air filtration equipment. Are you really gang members? She asked, equal parts curious and nervous. The biker, a grizzled man named Dutch, who had served 2 tours in Iraq before finding brotherhood with the Iron Wolves, paused his work and looked at her. We're a motorcycle club, he said. Some people think that makes us criminals, but mostly we're just men who found family on the road. We protect our own, and sometimes we help protect other people too. Why? Dutch thought about it. Because someone helped us once, when we needed it, and the world works better when people pass that forward instead of hoarding it. The girl considered this. Then she said, Can I take your picture? For an art project. Dutch grinned, his weathered face cracking into something almost handsome. Go ahead, kid. Just get my good side. The picture she took that day would eventually become part of a photography exhibition called Brotherhood. It would win awards and be featured in galleries across the South. But that was years in the future. Right now it was just a moment, a connection between two worlds that rarely touched, made possible by tragedy, transformed into generosity. Back at the hospital, Elijah's recovery continued. By the third week, he was out of bed, walking shakily at first with physical therapists guiding his steps. His mind was clearing, the fog that had clouded his thoughts lifting like morning mist. He began asking for books again, began writing in a journal the nurses had brought him. "What are you writing?" Destiny asked one afternoon. She had become a regular visitor, stopping by after her classes, sitting with Elijah while Marcus handled club business or caught up on the sleep he had missed during the crisis. Elijah looked up, a faint smile on his pale face. "I'm trying to make sense of what happened. All of it. The sickness, the studio, you, me? You saved my life and you're not even a doctor. You're not anything the world would consider important, but you saw something that 10 specialists missed. That's not supposed to happen, right? It breaks the rules of how things are supposed to work." Destiny shifted uncomfortably. "I just got lucky. Noticed something because of my own history. That's what I'm writing about," Elijah said. "How luck isn't really luck. How being invisible can sometimes give you a perspective that being visible doesn't. How the people who are ignored often see more clearly than the people everyone listens to." He paused, looking at her with an intensity that belied his youth. "You know what I want to do when I get out of here? When I'm healthy again? I want to write stories about people like you, people who do extraordinary things from ordinary places, people the world overlooks until they do something that can't be ignored." Destiny felt tears threatening, but fought them back. "You should focus on getting better. There's plenty of time for writing later." "That's what everyone says. But I almost died, Miss Destiny. I was 3 weeks from never writing anything again, so now I know that later is a lie we tell ourselves. There's only now. And right now, I want to write about you." She didn't know what to say, so she just sat there, in the quiet hospital room with a boy who had looked death in the face and come back with clarity instead of fear. The 4th week brought another milestone. Elijah was discharged from the hospital. The day was unseasonably warm for late November, sunlight streaming through windows that had only known rain for what seemed like forever. The Iron Wolves assembled in full force, their bikes creating a corridor of chrome and leather from the hospital entrance to the parking lot. Elijah, still thin and weak, but standing on his own feet, looked at the scene with wonder. "This is for me." Marcus put a hand on his son's shoulder. "This is for you. These men drove hundreds of miles to be here. They took shifts watching over you, making sure no one gave up on you. They rebuilt that studio so no one else gets hurt. And they did it all because you're one of us. Whether you ever ride a motorcycle or not, you're an Iron Wolf. You always will be." Elijah's eyes moved across the assembled bikers. These men he had known his whole life, who had seemed intimidating when he was small, and who now seemed like the most loyal, devoted family anyone could hope for. "Thank you," he said, his voice cracking. "All of you." Dutch stepped forward, holding something wrapped in cloth. "We made this for you. Figured you'd want to keep creating, even after everything." He handed the package to Elijah, who unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a small metal sculpture, a wolf, crafted from salvaged materials, sitting alert with its head raised. At its feet were the words, "Family is who shows up." Elijah held it for a long moment, unable to speak. Then he looked around until he found who he was looking for. Destiny. She was standing at the edge of the crowd, trying to be invisible as always, not wanting to intrude on this family moment. But Elijah walked straight toward her, the sculpture still in his hands. "This belongs to you," he said, holding it out. "No, I couldn't possibly. You're family now. My dad told you that, right? Well, I'm telling you too. Whatever happens next, wherever your life takes you, you're part of this, and He pressed the wolf into her hands. "This is proof. So when you forget, which you will because you think too small about yourself, you can look at this and remember that you matter, that you showed up when no one else did." Destiny looked at the sculpture, at the boy who had almost died, at the impossible circumstances that had brought them together, and for once in her life, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she was worth more than the world had always told her. The motorcycles roared to life. The Iron Wolves formed their convoy, escorting Elijah home in a procession that stopped traffic, drew stares, and became the talk of Memphis for weeks afterward. Some saw criminals, some saw danger, but those who looked closely saw something else. They saw brotherhood. They saw loyalty. They saw the fierce love of men who had found family in each other. And at the center of it all, in a black truck driven by his father, sat a boy who had been given a second chance at life. He would use it well. Chapter 5. 6 months passed. Spring arrived in Memphis like a forgiveness, washing away the cold gray of winter with warmth and color and the smell of magnolia blossoms. The city came alive with festivals and street music, with people rediscovering the joy of being outdoors after months of darkness. Elijah Stone was among them. His recovery had been remarkable, faster than anyone had expected. The chelation therapy had worked, pulling the toxic metals from his system and restoring function to organs that had been failing. There would be lingering effects, the doctors warned, some cognitive challenges, possible kidney issues later in life. The body had been damaged, and some of that damage was permanent, but Elijah was alive. And more than that, he was creating again. His writing had evolved during his recovery. Before the illness, he had written poems, beautiful but unfocused expressions of teenage emotion. Now he wrote with purpose, stories about invisible people, essays about environmental justice, a blog that had started as a personal journal and grown into something much larger. He called it The Overlooked, and it featured stories of people who had made profound differences from positions of powerlessness. Janitors who had discovered medical breakthroughs, prisoners who had taught themselves law and overturned unjust convictions, immigrants who had built communities from nothing. Each story was meticulously researched, beautifully written, and shared with a growing audience that seemed hungry for this kind of hope. The first feature had been about Destiny. He had titled it The Cleaning Lady Who Saved a Life, and it had gone viral in a way no one expected. Major news outlets picked it up. A producer from a documentary company reached out. Destiny, who had spent her entire life avoiding attention, found herself suddenly visible. At first she was terrified. She still worked at the hospital, still cleaning rooms and emptying trash cans between her final nursing classes. When people started recognizing her in the hallways, when colleagues who had never spoken to her before suddenly wanted to be friends, she didn't know how to respond. But Marcus had told her something during one of their conversations that stuck with her. Being invisible is a choice, he had said. Sometimes it's a smart choice, a survival choice, but it can also become a prison. At some point, you have to decide whether you want to stay hidden or step into the light. She had chosen the light. When the documentary company came calling, she agreed to participate. She told her story not for fame or fortune, but because she understood that her experience could help others, could show them that insight and intelligence weren't limited to people with fancy degrees, that anyone from anywhere could see something worth seeing if they paid attention. The documentary aired on a major streaming platform in April. It was titled The Diagnosis, and it focused on environmental health crises in urban communities, using Elijah's story as a central thread. Destiny's role was prominent, but not sensationalized. She came across as she was, smart, humble, deeply observant, the kind of person you might pass every day without noticing, until she did something that demanded attention. The response was overwhelming. Letters poured in from around the country, from other hospital workers who had noticed things and stayed silent, from patients who had been dismissed by doctors and were now encouraged to advocate for themselves, from young people in poor neighborhoods who saw themselves in Destiny and dared to imagine bigger futures. Dr. Vance watched all of this unfold with satisfaction. She had stayed in touch with both Destiny and the Stone family, checking on Elijah's progress, mentoring Destiny through the final stages of her nursing degree. When Destiny graduated in May, Dr. Vance was there in the audience, next to Marcus and Elijah, and a surprising number of Iron Wolves who cleaned up remarkably well when they tried. After the ceremony, Dr. Vance pulled Destiny aside. "I have something to discuss with you," she said, her voice serious. "About your future." Destiny's heart sank. Despite everything, despite the documentary and the attention and the promises of support, she still half expected it all to collapse. That was the lesson poverty had taught her. Good things don't last. "The scholarship fund the Stone family mentioned," Dr. Vance continued, "has been supplemented significantly. Several of the donors who saw the documentary have contributed. There's enough now to cover 4 years of medical school, plus living expenses." Destiny stared at her. Dared. "Medical school. I took the liberty of contacting several programs on your behalf. Based on your academic record, your clinical intuition, and frankly your story, 3 schools have expressed strong interest in your application. One has offered an interview next month. I can't. You can, Dr. Vance said firmly. You have the mind for this, Destiny. I've worked with thousands of students over the years, and I can count on one hand the ones who had your natural instinct, the ones who saw what you saw. This is not charity. This is an investment in someone who will make the world better. Destiny looked around the graduation hall, at the families celebrating, at the future stretching out ahead of everyone in their caps and gowns. For so long, her dreams had been modest. Finish school, get a stable job, maybe someday buy her grandmother a house with a garden. Medical school had never been part of the plan. It was too far away, too expensive, too far above her station. She had accepted that limit as fact, the same way she had accepted so many other limits imposed by circumstance. But here was someone telling her those limits were illusions. "I'll think about it," she said quietly. "Don't think too long," Dr. Vance replied, echoing what Marcus had said months ago. "The world needs more doctors like the one you could become." That night, Destiny sat alone in her grandmother's small apartment, the same apartment where she had grown up, where the pipes had once been toxic, where hope had once seemed like a luxury nobody could afford. Her grandmother had passed away 2 years ago, peacefully, in this very room, but Destiny still felt her presence, still heard her voice in moments of uncertainty. "Baby girl," her grandmother had said near the end, "don't let anyone tell you what you can be. They don't know, they can't see what's inside you. Only you can see that, and only you can decide whether to let it out or keep it hidden." Destiny looked at the wolf sculpture sitting on her shelf, the one Elijah had given her. Family is who shows up. She had shown up for Elijah when no one asked her to. She had spoken when silence would have been easier. She had trusted her instincts when everything in her experience told her to stay invisible. Maybe it was time to show up for herself. She picked up her phone and dialed Dr. Vance's number. "I'll do it," she said when the doctor answered. "I'll apply to medical school." She could hear the smile in Dr. Vance's voice. "That's the best news I've heard all year. I'll send you the application materials tomorrow." "Thank you," Destiny said, "for believing in me." "Thank yourself," Dr. Vance replied. "You did the hard part. You believed in yourself when no one else did. Everything else is just details." They talked for a few more minutes, about logistics, about timelines, about the road ahead. When Destiny hung up, she sat in silence for a long time, letting the magnitude of what she had just agreed to sink in. Then she laughed, not because anything was funny, but because life was strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Later that evening, after most of the guests had left, a smaller group gathered at the clubhouse on the outskirts of Memphis. This was the inner circle, the people who had been there during the darkest days, the ones who had earned the right to celebrate this victory. Destiny was because there. A year ago she had been nobody in the surroundings that were so foreign. Now she was on a path she had never dared to imagine. Because sometimes the smallest voice carries the biggest truth, and sometimes courage really is not certainty, it's willingness. Chapter 6. 1 year later, Elijah Stone published his first book. It was called Invisible Heroes, and it was a collection of true stories about ordinary people who had done extraordinary things from positions of obscurity. The first chapter was about destiny, but there were 11 others, each one a testament to the power of paying attention, of refusing to look away, of stepping forward when everyone else stepped back. The book launch took place at a renovated warehouse in Midtown Memphis, the same building that had once housed the art studio where Elijah had nearly lost his life. The new owners had transformed it into a community space dedicated to environmental health education and artistic expression. They called it the Stone Johnson Center, honoring both the boy who had almost died there and the woman who had saved him. Marcus Stone stood at the back of the room, watching his son address a crowd that included journalists, artists, activists, and more iron wolves than the venue had probably ever seen. Elijah was poised and eloquent, comfortable in the spotlight in a way Marcus had never been. He spoke about the importance of listening to unlikely voices, about the dangers of ignoring environmental health in underserved communities, about the debt he owed to a cleaning lady who had dared to see him when experts had looked past him. Destiny was there, sitting in the front row, her face a mixture of pride and embarrassment. She had just finished her first year of medical school, a grueling experience that had challenged her in ways she never expected. But she had survived. More than survived, she had thrived, earning top marks in clinical observation courses and becoming known among her professors for her uncanny ability to notice details that others missed. Sitting beside her was Dr. Vance, now serving as an informal mentor and advisor, and next to Dr. Vance was a young man named Thomas, a second-year medical student who had met Destiny during orientation week and had been captivated by her story, her intelligence and her quiet strength. They had been dating for 3 months, and though Destiny was still learning how to let someone into her carefully guarded heart, she was finding that it was less terrifying than she had always believed. The book launch was a success by every measure. Elijah sold out the initial print run before the event was over. Journalists clamored for interviews. Publishers who had initially rejected the manuscript called with suddenly enthusiastic offers for future projects. But the moment that would stay with everyone happened after the official program ended. As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus made his way to the front of the room, navigating through well-wishers and congratulations. He reached the small stage where Elijah was still standing, accepting handshakes and compliments. Father and son looked at each other. For a moment, neither spoke. Words had always been difficult between them, their personalities too different, their worlds too separate. Marcus communicated through action, through protection, through fierce loyalty that sometimes felt suffocating. Elijah communicated through words, through art, through a sensitivity that Marcus had never quite understood. But in this moment, understanding didn't matter. Only love did. "I'm proud of you," Marcus said. His voice was rough, the words coming hard. "Not because of the book, not because of any of this. I'm proud of who you've become." Elijah's eyes glistened. "I almost didn't get the chance to become anything. If it hadn't been for her." He looked across the room to where Destiny was laughing at something Dr. Vance had said. "She saw me when everyone else had given up. Even you were ready to say goodbye, Dad. I don't blame you for that. But she wasn't ready. A stranger, a cleaning lady, with nothing to gain and everything to lose, and she refused to let me go." Marcus followed his gaze. "I tried to repay her. The scholarship, the introductions, everything I could think of. But none of it seems like enough. That's because what she gave us can't be repaid with money. It can only be paid forward." Elijah reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a folded piece of paper. "Read this," he said, handing it to his father. Marcus unfolded the paper. It was a check, made out to a foundation he had never heard of. "What is this?" "The entire advance from the book. I'm donating it to an environmental health initiative for low-income communities, lead testing in old buildings, water quality assessment in schools, medical screenings for people who can't afford to see a doctor. Everything that should have happened in my case but didn't, because nobody was paying attention." Marcus stared at the check, at the sum, at his son's signature at the bottom. "You're giving away all of it? I don't need it. You've made sure I'll never want for anything material. But there are kids out there, right now drinking contaminated water, breathing toxic air, slowly getting sick the same way I did. And most of them don't have a Destiny Johnson in their lives. Most of them don't have anyone at all." He paused, his young face showing a wisdom beyond his years. "I lived when I should have died. That has to mean something, and this is how I'm making it mean something." Marcus felt something shifting in his chest, something like understanding maybe, or acceptance. His son was not going to be a biker, was never going to ride with the club or take over the leadership someday, but he was going to change the world in his own way, with words and conscience, and a generosity that Marcus had never known how to express himself. "Your mother would be proud too," Marcus said quietly, "if she could see you now." Elijah nodded. His mother had died when he was 7, victim of a car accident that had left Marcus shattered and Elijah half-orphaned. It was one of the reasons Marcus had been so protective, so terrified of losing his son. The boy was all he had left of her. "I think she can see," Elijah said. "I think she's always been watching." They embraced then, father and son, two very different men connected by blood and loss, and a love that transcended understanding. The crowd around them faded into background noise. For this moment there was only family. When they separated, Marcus wiped his eyes quickly, hoping no one had noticed. But his men had noticed. Of course they had, and not one of them said a word about it, because Iron Wolves understood that real strength included the courage to feel. But Elijah stayed close, making sure she felt included, making sure she understood that this gathering was for her as much as for him. Marcus stood at the head of the long table where meals were shared, and business was discussed, and brotherhood was forged. He raised a glass. "A year ago I thought I was going to bury my son. Every doctor, every specialist, every expert told me to prepare for the end, and I was ready to accept it, because that's what men like me have learned to do. Accept the things we can't change, endure the things we can't fix." His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed through. Then a young woman walked into his hospital room. A cleaning lady. Nobody important by the world's standards. She had no credentials, no authority, no reason to get involved. But she saw something, and more importantly, she had the courage to say something, to risk her job, her reputation, her future, for a stranger she owed nothing to. He turned to look at Destiny, who was trying very hard not to cry. Destiny Johnson, I don't have enough words to thank you, none of us do, but I hope you understand what you did. You didn't just save my son. You showed all of us what courage looks like, what paying attention looks like, what family means. He raised his glass higher. To Destiny, the woman who saw what everyone else missed, the woman who spoke when everyone else was silent, the woman who taught a room full of hard men that sometimes the smallest voice carries the biggest truth. To Destiny, the room echoed, glasses raised. She finally let the tears fall, surrounded by people she never would have imagined knowing, accepted into a family she never would have imagined being part of. Elijah leaned over and whispered, "Get used to it. They don't let go easily." She laughed through her tears. "I'm starting to figure that out." The evening continued with food and stories and laughter. The bikers shared tales of the road, of adventures and misadventures that seemed impossible to someone who had lived Destiny's sheltered life. But she listened with fascination, seeing beyond the leather and the tattoos to the humanity underneath. At one point, Dutch, the biker whose picture had become famous in the art exhibition, sat down beside her. "You know what the hardest part of what you did was?" he asked. "What?" "It wasn't seeing what the doctors missed. Lots of people see things. The hard part was saying it out loud, believing that what you saw mattered enough to risk everything for. Most people don't have that. They see, but they stay quiet. You didn't stay quiet." Destiny thought about that, about all the times in her life she had stayed quiet, had made herself smaller, had accepted limitations because fighting seemed too hard. "I almost didn't say anything," she admitted. "I stood outside that room for a full minute, arguing with myself, telling myself it wasn't my place, that I'd look stupid, that no one would listen anyway. What made you knock on the door?" She considered the question carefully. "I thought about my grandmother, about how she almost died because nobody paid attention to her, and I thought, if I walk away now and that boy dies, I'll never forgive myself. I'd rather be wrong and embarrassed than silent and guilty." Dutch nodded slowly. "That's wisdom, young lady. Wisdom most people never find in a whole lifetime. You found it at 23. He stood up, patting her shoulder. "The world's going to try to tell you that you got lucky, that what happened was a fluke. Don't listen. What you have, that ability to see and the courage to speak, that's real, and it's going to take you places you can't even imagine right now. Just don't let anyone convince you to be quiet again. Deal?" "Deal," Destiny said, meaning it. The night, gradually people began to leave, roaring off into the darkness on their motorcycles, heading home to families and beds and the ordinary lives that existed beneath the extraordinary brotherhood. Eventually, only Marcus, Elijah, and Destiny remained in the clubhouse, sitting around the dying embers of a fire someone had built in the corner. "What happens now?" Destiny asked, the exhaustion of the day catching up with her. "Now," Elijah said, stretching, "now I write more stories. Now you become a doctor. Now my dad pretends he's not getting emotional about everything, while secretly being emotional about everything." "I do not get emotional," Marcus grumbled, in a tone that suggested he absolutely did. They laughed together, the three of them, bound now by an experience that had transformed all their lives. "I mean it, though," Destiny said, growing serious. "What happens now? All of this, the attention, the opportunities, it still doesn't feel real. I keep waiting to wake up and be back to being invisible." Marcus leaned forward, his weathered face illuminated by the firelight. "You're never going to be invisible again, Destiny. Not to us, not to anyone who hears your story. But here's the thing about being seen. It's scary. It means people have expectations. It means you can't hide anymore. Some people crumble under that pressure. But you won't. You know why? Why? Because you didn't become someone special because of what happened with Elijah. You were always special. You were just waiting for a moment that demanded you show it. Now that the moment has passed, you don't go back to being nobody. You carry what you proved forward. You build on it. You become the person you were always capable of being." Destiny absorbed these words. They felt like a charge, a responsibility, and also a kind of liberation. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for believing in me, for not treating me like some kind of charity case, for making me feel like I belong somewhere." "You do belong," Elijah said. "Here with us forever. That's what family means." They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the fire fade. Then Marcus stood, signaling it was time to end the night. "Get some sleep," he said. "Both of you. There's more work to do tomorrow. There's always more work." He walked toward the door, then paused and looked back. "You know, a year ago I asked whoever might be listening to save my son. I said I'd give anything, everything. I didn't know what that meant at the time. Turns out it didn't mean what I thought. It didn't mean me making some sacrifice. It meant me opening my eyes, accepting help from someone I never would have looked at twice, learning that power doesn't always look like power." He shook his head slowly, a man still amazed by the lessons life continued to teach him. "I spent my whole life thinking strength meant never needing anyone. Now I know better. Strength is knowing when to need someone, and wisdom is recognizing them when they appear." He left then, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, the door closing softly behind him. Elijah and Destiny looked at each other. "He's not great with feelings," Elijah said, "but when he says something like that, he means it with everything he has." "I know," Destiny said. "I understood him perfectly." They sat a while longer, neither wanting to break the spell of the moment. Finally, Destiny said, "I should go. Early shift tomorrow. Still working at the hospital. Not for much longer. The documentary money, plus the scholarship, I can finally quit. Focus full-time on school. But you're working one more shift?" She smiled softly. "I wanted to say goodbye to the people there, to the halls where everything changed. It feels important to close that chapter properly." Elijah nodded. He understood the importance of proper endings. It was why he wrote books, why he shaped stories into things that made sense. "I'll walk you out," he said. They stepped into the cool night air. The sky above Memphis was clear, stars visible despite the city lights, the kind of night that made you feel small and significant at the same time. "Thank you," Elijah said. "I know I've said it 100 times, but thank you for seeing me, for speaking up, for being brave when everyone else had given up." Destiny reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you for writing about me, for making my story matter, for showing me that being visible doesn't have to be terrifying." They stood there for a moment. Two people whose lives had collided in impossible circumstances and emerged transformed. Then Destiny walked to her car, an old sedan that had seen better days, but still ran reliably. She waved once before getting in. Elijah watched her drive away, her taillights disappearing into the Memphis night. Then he looked up at the stars and smiled. Life was strange and beautiful and full of surprises. People who should have been enemies became family. People who should have been invisible became heroes. And sometimes, when you least expected it, grace arrived in the form of a knock on a hospital room door. He went back inside, already thinking about his next book. More stories to tell, more invisible heroes to celebrate, more proof that the world, despite all its darkness, was still capable of light. The fire had gone out completely now, but the room was still warm. Some warmth doesn't come from flames. If you watch this far, it's because this story touched something inside you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far," so I can get to know you and know who really appreciates the stories on this channel. Like this video, if you believe that anyone, from any background, can change the world when they choose to pay attention. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that courage is not certainty, it's willingness. That being seen is not as dangerous as staying invisible. That family is not just who you're born to, but who shows up when you need them most. And please subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. To keep our eyes open, to keep our hearts open, and to never ever underestimate the smallest voice, because sometimes that voice carries the biggest truth of all.